What was that like? The conversation off camera, like you walking around with him. What was the content of the conversation?
I mean, I can't, I feel bad even with Putin or anybody like talking about stuff that is off the record, but I'll just say that when I said that he didn't want to fight with NATO or with the U.S. State Department or with Joe Biden because he wants a settlement, that's a very informed perspective. He doesn't. You say whatever you want about that, believe it or not, but that is true. So
he's open for peace, for peace negotiations.
Look, Russia tried to join NATO in 2000. That's a fact. Okay, they tried to join NATO. So just think about this. NATO exists to keep Russia contained. Mm-hmm. It exists as a bulwark against Russian territorial expansion. And whether or not Russia has any territorial ambitions is another question. Like, why would it? It's the largest landmass in the world, whatever. But that's why it exists. So if Russia seeks to join NATO, it is by definition a sign that NATO's job is done here. We can declare victory and go home. The fact that they turned him down is like so shocking to me, but it's true. Then he approaches the next president, George W. Bush. That was with Bill Clinton at the end of his term in 2000. He approaches the next president and said, in our next missile deal, let's align on this, and we'll designate Iran as our common enemy. Iran, which is now, effectively in league with Russia, thanks to our insane policies. But, and George W. Bush, to his credit, is like, well, that seems like kind of an innovative, good idea. And Condi Rice, who's like one of the stupidest people ever to hold power in the United States, if I can say, who's like monomaniacally anti-Russia because she had an advisor at Stanford who was, or something during the Cold War. No, we can't do that. And Bush is just weak. And so he agreed. It's like, what? That is crazy. If you're fighting with someone and the person says, you know what, actually our interests align, and you've spent 80% of your mental disk space on hating me and opposing me or whatever, but actually we can be on the same team. If you don't at least see that as progress, like what? Why would you? If your interest is in helping your country, what's the counter argument? I don't even understand it. And no one has even addressed any of this. The war of Russian aggression. Yeah, it was a war of Russian aggression for sure. But how did we get there? We got there because Joe Biden and Tony Blinken dispatched Kamala Harris, who does not freelance this stuff, okay? Fair to say, to the Munich Security Conference 2 years ago this month, February 2022, and said in a press conference to Zelensky, poor Zelensky, we want you to join NATO. This was not in a backroom thing. This was in public at a press conference. Knowing, because he said it like 4,000 times, we don't want nuclear weapons from the United States or NATO on our western border. Duh. And days later, he invaded. So like, what is that? And I raised that question in my previous job, and I was denounced as, of course, a traitor or something. But okay, great, I'm a traitor. What's the answer? These are not Toria Nuland, who I know, not dumb, hasn't helped the U.S. in any way, an architect of the Iraq War, architect of this disaster, one of the people who destroyed the U.S. dollar. Okay, fine. But she's not stupid. So like, you're trying to get a war by acting that way. What's the other explanation? By the way, NATO didn't want Ukraine because it didn't meet the criteria. So for admission. So why would you say that? Because you want a war. That's why. And that war has enriched a lot of people to the tune of billions. So I don't care if I sound like some kind of left-wing conspiracy nut, because I'm neither left-wing nor a conspiracy nut. Tell me how I'm wrong.
Who do you think is behind it? If you were to analyze, like zoom out, looking at the entirety of human history, the military-industrial complex, you said Kamala Harris. Is it individuals? Is it like this collective flock that people are just pro-war as a collective?
It's the hive mind. And I, spent my whole life in DC from 85 to 2020, so 35 years. And again, I grew up around it in that world. And I do think that conspiracies Of course, there are conspiracies, but in general, the hive mind is responsible for the worst decisions. It's a bunch of people with the same views, totally, views that have not been updated in decades. Putin said something that I thought was absolutely true. I don't know how he would know this, but it is true because I lived among them. So the Soviet Union dissolves in August of 91 on my honeymoon in Bermuda. I'll never forget it. And it was a big thing, If you lived in D.C., the receptionist in my office in 1991 was getting a master's in Russian from Georgetown. He was going to be a Sovietologist. And he was among, thousands of people in Washington on that same track. And so the Soviet Union collapses. Well, so does the rationale for a good portion of the U.S. government has been dedicated for over 40 years to opposing this thing that no longer exists. So there's a lot of forward momentum. There's a huge amount of money, the bulk of the money in the richest country in the world, aimed in this direction. And it's very hard for people to readjust, to reassess. And you see this in life all the time. I love my wife. All of a sudden she ran off with my best friend. Holy shit. I didn't expect that this morning. Now it's a reality. Like, how do I deal with that? Well, I got stage 4 cancer diagnosis. Okay. And it's all bad, but I'm just saying, that's the nature of life. Things that you did not anticipate, never thought you'd have to face, happen out of nowhere. And you have to adjust your expectations and your goals. And people have a hard time with that, very hard time with that. So that's a lot of it. People, if you're Condi Rice, sort of like highly ambitious midwit who gets this degree from Stanford, and you read Tolstoy in the original, sure you did. And you spent your whole life thinking that Russia is the center of evil in the world. It's kind of hard to be like, well, actually, there's a new threat and it's coming from farther east. It's primarily an economic threat. And maybe all the threats aren't reduced to tank battles. That's the other thing, is these people are so inelastic in their thinking, so lacking imagination and flexibility, that they can't sort of imagine a new framework. And the new framework is not that you're going to go to war with China over Formosa, Taiwan. No, the framework is that all of a sudden, all the infrastructure in Tijuana is going to be built by China. And that's a different kind of threat. But they can't kind of get there because they're not that impressive.
So you've mentioned this. It's not just the Cold War, it's World War II that populates most of their thinking in Washington. You mentioned Churchill, Chamberlain, and Hitler, and they kind of seeing the World War II as the kind of the good war and the successful role the United States played in that war. They're kind of seeing that dynamic, that geopolitical dynamic, and applying it everywhere else still.
Yeah, it's a template for everything. And I think it's of huge significance to the development of the West, to the civilization we live in now, to world history. It was a world war. And so I think it's worth knowing a lot about and being honest about and all the rest. But it's hardly the sum total of human history. Yeah. It's a snapshot. And so you keep hearing people refer to not even the war. No one ever talks about the war. How much does Tony Blinken know about the Battle of Stalingrad? Probably zero. Doesn't know anything. Largest battle in human history. But I bet he knows nothing. But he knows a lot about the cliches surrounding the 38 to 40 period, 1938 to 1940. And everything is kind of expressed through that formula. And not everything is that formula. That's all I'm saying. And the Republicans have a strange weakness for it, particularly the closeted ones, the weird ones who were have no life other than starting more wars. Everything to them, the most vulnerable, I would say, among them, emotionally, psychologically vulnerable, the dumbest, they will always say the same thing. And it appeals to Republican voters, unfortunately, that every problem is the result of weakness. Everyone's Chamberlain. Germany never would have gone into Poland and Czechoslovakia if England had been stronger. That's the argument. Is that true? I don't know, actually. Maybe. It might be totally true. It might not be true at all. I really don't know. But not everything is that. That's not always true. If I go up to you in a bar and I say, I hate your necktie, I'm being pretty aggressive with you, pretty strong. You might beat the shit out of me, actually, or shoot me if I do that. An aggressive posture doesn't always get you the outcome that you want. Sometimes it requires a more sophisticated Mediterranean posture. I mean, it kind of depends. It's a time and place thing. And they don't acknowledge that. It's like everything is this same template. And that's not the road to good decision making at all.